Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next computer side chat. Today we are going to be focusing on the U.S. Constitution and start to introduce some of the key concepts within the Constitution itself, focusing on first the key principles behind it, which a lot of that will be a review of the principles that we talked about at the beginning of the last unit with a few additions, and then getting into what will be the brunt of the notes, which is going to be looking at the 6 goals of the Constitution as laid out in the preamble. Those goals are going to be important for us because ultimately what we want to be able to do by the end of this unit is point to specific examples within the Constitution of how government is set up in a way that it is able to accomplish those goals. So let's go ahead and get into things. So the title for this set of slides is going to be Principles and Goals of the U.S. Constitution. And our central question is, what are the guiding principles and goals behind the U.S. Constitution? We just want to make sure that we know those on a very base level by the end of these notes so that we can get into more advanced things going forward. So let's start with the guiding principles of the Constitution. And I want to start by reviewing the ones that are familiar to us, that we already went over in our last unit. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, just list them, give a brief review and reminder of what they are before we move on to our 2 additions to this list. So the first was limited government. This meant that government power is not absolute. There are restrictions placed on government power. Next is popular sovereignty. This means that government power comes from the people and that in order for government to have power, people must give them that power. Next is protection of natural rights. This is the idea of protecting and ensuring that these natural rights, as mentioned by John Locke, are not violated. Those rights, again, are life, liberty, and property. Going hand in hand with protection of natural rights is the idea of due process, which essentially says that government cannot take those rights away from you unless first you are given a trial by jury to prove your guilt or innocence over some issue that would require that the government throw you in jail or take property away from you or what have you. Next, separation of powers, which means that government is split into 3 branches, and as part of that, checks and balances, which is the fact that these 3 branches all have ways of checking and balancing each other out. And then lastly, for the ones that we've already gone over, is rule of law. Government is based on clear and fairly enforced laws. No one is above the law. So again, those should look familiar from our previous unit. We talked about these to start out that unit. There are 2 that we didn't include here. The first was representative government. We're just going to go ahead and put that hand in hand with popular sovereignty. The other one is written constitution because we're talking about the Constitution. So in other words, I don't think there's really a reason to include that as one of the principles one of the principles of having a written constitution seems pretty obvious when we're talking about a written constitution. So let's get into our 2 additions then. Guiding principles of the Constitution that were not a part of those early American principles dating back to colonial days. The first one is federalism. And federalism is the division of power between the state and federal level of government. So think of it as separation of powers, but rather than across branches, in other words, horizontal across either a federal or state level, it's separating powers vertically between state and federal levels of government. And so federalism, or a federal system, defines what powers the federal government has, what powers the states have, what powers they share, and what powers they're not able to use. Next is an independent judiciary. And what this simply means is that there is a system of courts and judges that are independent of the other branches of government. They're also independent of things like politics and political parties so that they are able to make decisions independently and freely of those influences. So these are the two additions to these principles, is the idea of separating state and federal power and having a court system that is independent both from other branches as well as being free of political ties. So that wraps up the principles. Like I said, we were going to move through that pretty quickly. Now we want to move into the goals of the U.S. Constitution. And we find those goals laid out in the preamble, which you can see here in front of you, and which states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So this is the preamble, and within that are 6 goals that this Constitution is looking to accomplish. Let's start to break those goals down now. So as I go through these, I'm going to dissect the preamble and then talk about each of these lines. You're definitely going to want to include kind of a summary as I go through these of what each of these goals mean. So first off, form a more perfect union. This simply means that we want to foster cooperation between the states as well as between the state and federal levels of government. So that's what we mean when we say form a more perfect union, is create a more unified and cooperative system for the states and between the federal and state levels of government. Secondly is establish justice. This means, the desire to create government based around based around fair laws that apply equally to everyone. So in other words, creating a just society. Next is ensure domestic tranquility. This means that we want to ensure order and peace for those living within the United States. Fourth, provide for the common defense. This means we want to protect the people of the United States from outside or foreign threats. Fifth is promote the general welfare, which means that the government should ensure the well-being of all of its citizens. And then sixth, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This means that we want to secure freedom, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. So those are the 6 goals. So again, create a more cooperative country between states as well as the states, governments, and the federal government. Establish justice. Create a just society based around laws that are fairly enforced and apply to everyone equally. Provide for the common defense, which means that we want to protect citizens from outside threats. I skipped one there, apologies. Ensure domestic tranquility, which means that we want to maintain peace and order within the United States. Fifth, promote the general welfare, which means that we want to promote the overall well-being of citizens within the U.S. And then sixth, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, which refers to the fact that we want to secure freedom and the benefits of freedom, not just for ourselves, but for future generations as well. So that is a really quick rundown of the principles and goals within the Constitution. Pretty simple, hopefully. I don't think that was really complex stuff. And that was kind of the goal here. I wanted to keep it simple so that as we move into things tomorrow and the days going forward, that these simple things will be able to get into more complex topics and more complex ideas with regards to them. And this basic framework should make it easier for us to do that. So from here, as always, go to the questions section. What questions do you have? Then summarize your notes, and hopefully that will leave you ready for the quiz tomorrow. I will see you then. Have a good night.